Welcome once again to the series of interviews that Baki Tezcan and I, Amy Singer, are conducting with past presidents of the Turkish Studies Association, which is now the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. Our guest today is William Griswold, who was president of the TSA from 1988 to 1990, according to the records that I have. And as with our other interviewees, we're going to ask you a kind of easy question to get started, which is, how did you get into all this? What brought you to the Ottoman Empire?
Initially, the Ottoman Empire, in a sense, came to me through my marriage. My wife was bound and determined to do something to just stay home and teach school. So we married on the assumption that I would go with her, as I said, anywhere in the world. Of course, when you're in love with a young lady, you do make these promises. And suddenly the American board of our church, the Congregational Church, had openings in Turkey to teach school. And I had a teaching credential, as did she. And so we went to a tiny village out in central Anatolia called Talas in the area of Kayseri. The province was Kayseri. And there we thought we were going to do 3 years of teaching and then go back. And we stayed an extra year, had our first child, who became the darling of the students. It was a junior high school. It was a time to learn, to make mistakes, to find out about people totally different from our civilization, at least as we'd been in those days. And we simply fell in love with Turkey. And so when I came back, I had changed my devotion to medieval studies, medieval European, to getting a PhD at UCLA in what I guess was called Ottoman Studies, although it hadn't even been talked about at all. There was a guy who was going to come and take care of this matter. His name was Andreas TSA, and TSA became my teacher. And I could never have asked for any person more gentle, more charming, more decent, and more demanding than Andreas TSA. He certainly got the essences of everything I had, and then a little more in the learning of the Ottoman language. And of course, the first thing he did was say, well, of course, you must take Arabic, along with the French and the German language exams that you have to take too. So I was overcome by realizing that I had stepped into something that I had not anticipated. But the joy was the fact that I'd been overseas in Turkey and knew enough about Turkey and about living in different civilizations, and was a little more mature than my colleagues, all of whom were right out of undergraduate school, pretty much. Not all, but many of them. And so when I went to UCLA, I was one of the older guys. I was in my 30s. That's pretty late to start a regimen like Ottoman Turkish language, but I was there. And we were sent off to housing on the campus. We had 2 more children come with us. We lived on campus for 4 years. I had an old car. It wasn't a very great car, but it was maneuverable. And so my head of my department, whose name was Gustav von Grunebaum, said, oh, you can take your car to get someone from the airport. And from time to time, I would get a notification from the secretary of the von Grunebaum and say, well, there's a British scholar coming into the airport at about 7 o'clock. He got there at midnight, I think it was, but please go and meet him. His name is Gibb, H-A-R Gibb. My God, I'm going to meet H.A.R. Gibb. There he was, looking like a Scotch, I don't know what he was, wearing a tam or something. And so I was able to drive him all over Southern California, Huntington Library and things like that, where he was interested in going, because I was just a young man who had a car. He didn't mind how old it was, and it got along in the freeways. And so there I was, a useful person of value for the department in much different ways than most of the students, I guess.
Do you remember who your colleagues were in class? The people who sat with you in TSA's classes?
Well, TSA had a very few students, nobody but myself in the advanced study of Turkish. I didn't have Turkish, so I was put in the advanced section.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that I do remember was a man who didn't ever go into the academic world. His name was M.A. Griffiths. We called him Griff. And Griffiths was trying to establish something he wanted to call the semester at sea.
Oh.
And he was the one who said, you got to go on that trip with me sometime. And I thought, yeah, I want to go on. I've got 600 students. I don't need to go on the trip. But that's another story, unless you want to go into it. But Griff was marvelous. He and his wife got together with us, and so we were able to transform his military background. He had been a colonel in the army. In fact, he told me he was bombing Japan during the war. You see, I was a member of the armed forces. I'm old enough to have been 2 years in the Navy. So we had some of those things in common. Not a lot, because he was an officer and I was what we called an enlisted slob. But, well, I'm getting carried away. The other valued friends were members of generally the graduate school. I knew more of the professors than the students, because I, of course, had my own family to go to, and so there was not a lot of interaction among us graduate students.
Interesting. So different socially than what we depend on today.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, everything was just beginning.
Yeah.
Sort of like, what was it? Dean Acheson writes about present at the creation. That's kind of what I was at, because when I walked into the Turkish class, here was an African-American young man who didn't really know why he was there. And TSA didn't respond to him particularly well. The kid didn't really understand Turkish. So about 2 weeks later, he was gone. I don't know whatever happened to him and why he got in there in the first place, but that was the kind of thing that would happen at UCLA. There were just a lot of new things happening. There was a strong movement for having an African studies program.
Yeah.
That finally established itself, but that was while I was there.
Okay.
I got there in when I started was 58. 1958, that's pretty early.
Wow.
Well, I didn't have a lot of colleagues, not then, but my home was the seat of many scholars who would come in. First thing that happened was that, if you're into that part of the story, was the presence of a new couple who needed to be in student housing we lived in these barracks. They had been really rundown barracks, but it was home. And the man who was coming was a man named İlhan Başgöz. And İlhan Başgöz was a Turkish scholar with some renown, I learned later. And he had a delightful wife named Bedi Hanım. And he also had two delightful 5-year-old girls, Aslı and Nesli. I hate to say this morning that Nesli just passed away about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I guess. And here were these marvelous kids. And I remember Aslı saying, Ruthie is so smart. Ruthie was my daughter. She was about 6, I think, at the time. Ruthie is so smart. She can speak English. And we laughed about that because, yeah, they had to stumble for a while. They, as you probably knew, ended up with stellar careers. But İlhan Başgöz was very helpful in my understanding of the Turkish academic world, and we had many experiences. I'll never forget the time when, oh dear, I can't remember the exact date, but we were afraid that we were going to get bombed by some accident of American foreign policy. And he was walking around the place where we had our housing. And I said, İlhan, what's happening? It says, Susbe, don't talk. And I said, what's the matter? And he says, I found out later, he was writing a poem. And he said, when I get upset, I write poetry. And so I was writing a poem in Turkish, telling about the problem of the world at that time. Fortunately, we weren't bombed and everything went on, but so I'm digressing. But the number of students was minor. It was mostly important people coming in. I wrote some of them down. TSA and so forth. Bertrand Spula, German guy. You probably have heard of him. And my first teacher was Spiros Vironis. He was just out of Harvard. He never taught a class before. And oh boy, did he have things to say and things to do, and very exciting. And of course, I'd been teaching for 6 years by that time, so it was amusing, but I learned an awful lot from him. And he was not easy.
Wow. I think I'm going to let Baki pick it up.
Yes,
Here.
Your responses already touched upon the couple of questions we had for you. One of them was, how much were you able to learn about Ottoman Empire and Turkey at your graduate school? And I think you explained to us that you were able to work with Professor TSA, Andreas TSA, then İlhan Başgöz came, and Spiros Vironis. So you actually had a great trio. Spiros Vironis, late Byzantine, medieval Anatolia, the Seljuks. So you had that medieval background. You had Andreas TSA, a great scholar of Turkish language, Ottoman period, and İlhan Başgöz, a great scholar of ethnography or folklore of Anatolia. So you had a very good foundation. I guess you were really lucky, and you were super lucky, I think, because you say this was the beginning, so you didn't have a lot of students, so you had them all to yourself. So that sounds wonderful. And you also said something about a student who was with you who actually didn't become an academic, and that is also something we are curious about. You already mentioned he became the founder of Semester at Sea. Did you, during your lifetime, come across to others who ended up having PhD studies, but then did other things? Anybody else comes up? This is one of the things we ask because we are curious about alternative career paths for people who do, Ottoman Turkey kind of things.
There were several that came to my knowledge, not only here, but in Istanbul when they went over as a graduate student. And obtained a scholarship, fellowship to study and do my PhD dissertation. And so, of course, most of the people that I met were foreign to the United States. Right off the bat, when I got into the Baki Tezcan was a young guy from Israel. His name was Moshe Maoz, and Moshe is even today. I don't know whether he's still alive, but he was a very dear friend, and he would come over and visit us in Istanbul. We again had a small little place where we lived for 2 years with a family, and he, of course, introduced me to all of his friends who were at the archives or working around it, and to all the good places to eat. Because if you needed food and you didn't have a lot of money, and most of us didn't and did need food, they had ways of getting to the student dorms or wherever it was, and we just had lots of fun in those areas. Students are students, I guess. They do. Here I'm looking at some of the, one of the people I remember very well was Fahir was a marvelous linguist, and he came over and thought that my wife's cooking was pretty good. So he would, and you have to remember that at UCLA we lived at these barracks, and they had been used during the war, during the Second World War, for workers at the place where they built ships. And so they were very narrow, very small. We had a maybe 4x4 dining room. It was also the living rooms where we had our beds and everything. You can imagine, students do this. But Farias thought it was wonderful. And he sat there and told us many wonderful stories about what he was involved in. It was then I got the idea of working on the Jalali studies that I made. And people like Fahir and Shpura were very helpful in putting me in the right direction. But there were just dozens of other. Oh, I had a whole list of them. Let me read. We can talk about some of them. When I got to the archives, of course, this was my 4th year there. The most important man that I learned to know and love and respect highly was nothing but a simple soul who had done his own Turkish studies, his own studies in his own language, but he was working in the archives as a memur. And as that, he had all kinds of questions of me about translating from Turkish to English for his own purposes. And I learned then that if you want to get along in the archives, best thing to do is to see what you can do to help somebody who needs an English translation for maybe something like his automobile. And so Turgut Bey would ask me to translate a letter, and we would send it off, and then he would get something. And suddenly an archival document was available. It was really wonderful. It's the way it's done. And I had remembered some very important names. I don't know whether I should mention them, were who he would refer to and say, well, he does not think my requests are important, so he and I don't talk very much. And I suspect he didn't get the documents he needed. And there are plenty of documents in the Baki Archivi for everybody, but things like that were the personal part of research and academia that you never know about until you get into it. Striking. But who else did I know? Yeah. Oh, there was Stan Shaw. Stan Shaw was a wonderful guy. He had a car. I think it was a Cadillac or something. And he lived close by us in Rumeli Azar. And he really nursed that Carly. He wasn't married then. He was just working in the archives, and he had all kinds of stories to tell. My goodness. You're punching buttons to create memories in my mind.
I hope they're pleasant ones. I mean, as you talk, I'm certainly reliving some of the more colorful moments of my own archive experience. And I think that the archives have become quite large, and the work facilities have become very large to accommodate the large numbers of scholars, both from Turkey and from other places, who in normal times are working there. And
I've never seen those. Those are new ones.
yeah, but I actually started work in the archive buildings that were in the Emniyet Müdürlüğü garden, which is probably where you worked, I'm suspecting, behind the Baba Ali.
Yeah. So it was. And it was rather a small room. There were about 4 or 5 big tables in this room.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the same room, but but there was definitely a sense of, there weren't very many people there ever. There weren't very many foreigners, especially once the summer was done. But because you had to sit there and write things out by hand, you really spent a long time and you got to know people. And you began to understand how to ask people questions, who was good for these kinds of questions and who was good for those kinds of questions. And little by little, people would come in and come through, and you would put names to faces to names that you'd heard. It's quite something, I think.
A world of its own. Really, you can't, unless you've been in it, you can't really explain it as something.
Yeah. So did you go back frequently to the archives once you'd finished your dissertation?
No, because my life took a different change. When I got back, I was so much involved in university life that I was just toying with this idea. Should you make a decision not to do heavy duty research and go into academic worlds that are more locally directed, or should you stay with the wonderful opportunities that you get with overseas work? And I chose the former, partly because of the family. I had 3 kids, and summers were you could do one or the other. You could stay home or go traveling around the United States, or you could move by yourself to Istanbul and stay there the summer, and then what does the family do? So those are questions I had to ask, and I think the answer came sort of by just like Topsy. It just growed. It didn't really have any logic to it, except I seem to be more important at home than in the archives. But I missed them. I missed the opportunities. There were so many interesting people.
I can definitely sympathize with that. Once while raising kids, we could only spend time in Turkey for maybe at most a couple of weeks at a time, because my partner wife, she has a career too, and she doesn't have a whole lot to do there. And so we spend more summers here in the States, and I shifted more to manuscript research rather than Ottoman archives research, because in the archives you kind of need to spend long periods of time to get into things. With manuscripts, which I was lucky at right around the time when I was receiving my PhD, this digitization project took off, and you could just ask for manuscripts. They would give you CDs of them with images in them. And so that made it very easy to do research on manuscripts. It revolutionized, I think, in terms of, because you could just order it and then get a CD that includes 5 manuscripts, and there you go. You have a lot of stuff to work with. And now they have it online. You can actually download manuscript by paying for it. So things got a, but archives definitely requires long periods of time to get something out of them. So
Well, I just want to comment there, just to fill in the picture, that the archives also have changed radically. And so if you go to the archives, it's very rare that you will see original materials, because the
Really?
materials have largely been scanned. And you can see a lot of the catalogs online before you ever come. So you can be very efficient, arrive with lists already, order things, or actually you can look at them on a computer screen sitting in the archives workroom, and then make a list of the things that you want copies of, pay for them, and then you also get a CD. And in some ways, I think it's very good, because it means that it's not nearly as expensive for people to come and get the materials that they need for their research. It means that people with families can actually come for a week or two and go off afterwards with what they needed. But I think that what you lose is what we had very early on, which was this kind of ongoing seminar in the archives.
Yes.
Where everybody around you was doing what you were doing. So you never had to explain or justify, but you always had someone to ask, and you always had someone to talk to about ideas. And so there's a kind of trade-off, but I think even the archives have, the work there has changed. I mean, I was very spoiled for 30 years coming from Tel Aviv, because I could go to Turkey at the drop of a hat, stay for 4 days, come back. So it was very easy.
one of my PhD students tells me now, because of Corona, they put more things online at the archives. So you can see and download much more without even going there, apparently, at the moment. So that's, I guess, one of the
Wow,
things that
I might
happens
try.
with Corona, under Corona.
So Bill, I have to ask you though, I mean, you sort of provided us the perfect entree to ask you. I mean, you said that you stayed based in the US much more, but it seems that you stayed involved with Ottoman studies. I mean, you were president of the Turkish Studies Association in 1988, which is not immediately after you finished your dissertation. So what was the shape of your continuing involvement with people in Ottoman studies?
Oh, one of the really great features of the scholarship, or the help I got from two very important places, was the fact that when I got to Istanbul and went to the chief of the project, it was the ARIT Award, American Research Institute in Turkey. And here was a guy sitting there, and I said, well, first I'd gone to TSA and said, how do you pronounce this name? It's got SZY something or other. And he says, you go ask for Professor Shulovich. I said, who? Shulovich. So I went down and I knocked on the door, and here's this guy, lots of hair in those days. And I said, I'm looking for Professor Shulovich. And he said, well, I don't know who the hell that is, and I'm Joe Shulovich, and I'm happy to see you. And so there was Joe Shulovich. And Joe and I have been dear friends. In fact, they were just over at our house 2 weeks ago for dinner. Joe and Irene were there heading up that research institute. And starting off, they were in the home of Fuad Köprülü. It was his library or something built into the walls of Istanbul, the ones that, of great lore. Joe and his family were in charge of whatever it was he did, and he met most of the, you'll maybe want to interview him because I don't know whether he was the president of ever, but he was always involved with Turkish studies. And Joe was very helpful. So we were able to, I've missed, I'm so involved in talking about Joe, I've forgotten your question, Amy. Did you?
Oh, yeah. So, well, I mean, you started to answer it, but so you didn't really go back to Istanbul to do research extensively once you'd finished your dissertation, but you did stay very involved with with Ottoman and Turkish studies. So
Oh,
what did that look like in those days? I mean,
I kept involved I was the only one in northern Colorado that had anything to do with the Ottoman Turks. And of course, I would be asked to give talks and so forth. And we had quite a community of Turkish students here at the university that I was assigned to. And so I was involved in that. But I think the fact that Joe was here, and it was, Denver is not too far from Fort Collins where I live. And so we could zip down there and see people who were connected with all kinds of international affairs. There was a guy named Corbell who was the head of the DU graduate school. Joseph Corbell had a daughter who became Secretary of State. And that kind of thing just sort of evolved and grew amazingly. So Denver became quite a source. And whenever someone like Halil Inalcik would come to town, he'd stay with Joe. And I remember him in those days, this was early in his career. He hadn't, I don't know whether he'd gone to Chicago or not, and he was complaining to me about the fact that they hadn't appreciated him. And I thought, well, that's too bad because he's certainly a valuable person. And it was just, there they were. And I could hear them talking, and they were expressing their ideas very clearly. So why go back to Istanbul? Istanbul comes to us pretty much. I didn't think of it that way, but that's
right.
what happened.
And did you also go to the MESA meetings regularly?
Oh, yeah, we could.
Mhm.
Regularly. I was looking them all up, and there was a whole bunch of them that I didn't go to, but they held them at Denver on 2 or 3 occasions, but particularly 71 when my friend Bill Hickman was the head of the whatever it was he was head of. He was not an Ottoman historian, but Turkish studies at Berkeley.
Right.
So yeah, it was just a gathering together of a lot of people interested in the Turkish experience. And of course, they're
Okay.
crazy.
This gives us a great opening to talk about the TSA. Back then it was called Turkish Studies Association. Now it's Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. So you got to know the association through your colleagues, friends, and at MESA meetings. And then how did you can you tell us a little bit about your involvement with the association and how you came to be the president of it?
Well, I think that it began with the MESA establishment. See, we were into Ottoman studies long before MESA. And then they started worrying about the importance of studying this region and why it was important for the United States government to realize the value of these people. And so we began meeting. And I remember von Grunebaum was welcoming him to this big inner meeting of all the big shots who were planning to establish a thing called Middle East Studies and having a name, MESA and all that. And then that, of course, triggered several groups establishing their own group, own organizations, Turkish being one of them, Greeks being another, Armenians being another. Oh dear, who was a good friend of mine who got very angry at me because I was not sympathetic with his Armenian, Hovhannisyan. He was a UCLA guy, and he and I were good friends at UCLA. We, I reviewed one of his books and gave it. It was very well done, and he was appreciative of that. And then I had done a little less positive review of another one of his books, and we were not good friends after that. So, you know, there gets to be a little bit of a clash of interests. But as far as the Turks were concerned, we ought to have a Turkish Studies Association. So we all gathered together, people who were all the old guard, anyone you want to say about Turkish studies in those days was there. And we established an organization that some of the presidents were very, very vital and worked hard. It was never something that was in the center part of their activities, but it was something that was important to them. Like, is that they had their other obligations. Many of them were world famous and had books to write and letters to do. But most of them were very concerned about the role of Turkey and the changes that were going on even then. Really serious. I'm not sure I've answered your question.
I think that you certainly answered it in good measure. I'm going to ask you something that is somewhat timely, but I have a feeling it's always been timely for our organization, which is, did you feel torn or pressured by current events to take a stand about Turkey? Or were you able to kind of claim intellectual distance from current events?
There were times when I would write letters and get very stinging rebukes from people. When I particularly was involved in the famous letter that they wrote to the New York Times or something like that. Bernard Lewis was pushing that. And Lewis came here on my request to speak to our university, and we have a whole series of lectures, and he was instrumental in pushing the role of the Turks in this whole business of, I can't remember whether it was the Armenian issue then or the Greek issues, but I did take part in that. Never to any people out in Colorado certainly didn't really have a deep concern about whether the Turks were doing something evil to the Armenians in the 1920s. They just didn't know anything about it. They're more interested in horses and cattle and things like that. This is I'm not really answering your question, but there was some of that. We had a great deal more student revolutions, things of that nature, that I was on one major faculty committee that tried to help students come to some senses. And our house here, very close to the university, was used by students to get away from police and things like that from time to time. A certain awkwardness as scholars from your daily task of correcting papers and formulating notes for your next lecture, to have students come in and really lay their troubles, saying, please don't give me a D or an F because I'm going to be drafted or something horrible like that. So there were all kinds of local problems to solve. It didn't get us too much involved in the Turkish issues, although they were there.
Mhm.
I haven't answered that very well, but that's one I hadn't thought about for a long time.
Well,
Yeah.
your answer suggests for you, the local stuff about Colorado where you are mattered in your daily life in teaching. And that is very understandable because you're at a state university and there are different expectations. So it makes perfect sense. I am, though, curious about the job market at the time you were, because one of our questions concerns could our organization help with graduate students, jobs, etc. At the time you were involved, I imagine the organization didn't have much in the membership who are only graduate students. Was it more people who already have jobs who were the main membership of the organization? And then how was one getting a job back then? How did you get your job? I'm sure people would be interested in hearing about changing in job markets in Ottoman studies too.
Well, it's changed so greatly, as you can imagine. Today, it's virtually impossible to get a job, particularly as a historian. Who cares about that? Now, if you're working in some scientific aperture, well, sure, there are jobs available. But those days, they were expanding in the liberal arts. And the president of the university told our department chair, we need to have you expand from 4 members of the department to about 14. Well, you got to fill some holes there. And so my professor, the chair of my department, wrote to various universities wondering about a Middle East historian, not Ottoman, but Middle East. And von Grunebaum, very smart man that he was, thank you, said, I have a guy named Griswold and he might work out for you. So with that recommendation, we came to Fort Collins. My wife said, well, it's all right. It's kind of a sweet little town. We'll stay here a couple of years, then go back to where God lives, because God lives in California. Everybody knew that, where UCLA was and everything. And I was anxious to do the right thing, so good, we'll stay 2 years. Well, it's been 50 some odd, 60 maybe, and we've not left because we found that this place, well, we thought they needed a Middle Eastern historian. A lot of people wonder, what is the Middle East and who cares when whether or not the alfalfa crop is going to be better this year? Far more important to question than Ottoman Turks. But then it was the fact that I'd been a teacher for so long and my classes were very successful and they were building. A lot of people wanted to come and hear about the Middle East. And so it worked out very much for my benefit. But today, it's quite different. I understand that there are just no jobs. They're thinking of cutting back. Why do you need a Middle Eastern historian when we don't really care that much about it? We need just the standard courses for good students to become well educated and let it go at that. So it has changed considerably. And I feel very sorry for the young people who are desperately looking for jobs. And in your material that you had me read here, what can the TSA do about getting jobs? Well, here at CSU, it's going to be difficult. Now, if they were in some kind of animal husbandry or some kind of science of the local virus problem on the, yes, we have jobs and good salaries. The lowest on the salary list are the language people, but next lowest are the history, as I understand it. So you don't come here to make money, that's for sure.
Although I suspect your money goes farther there than it would in Los Angeles.
Oh, yes, yes. It has always been much better.
And you might be pleased to hear that our new officer for the organization to fill the position of secretary is from Colorado, University of Colorado. I believe she is at Colorado Springs.
Yeah, she is.
Carol Woodall. She'll
Yep.
be joining the officer corps of the association as the secretary as of the end of this year and then next year on. So Colorado continues to be very well represented in the association.
Well, we had some people come in. There was a wonderful young lady who came, 15 or 20 years ago, and she stayed just a year and then got a job at a decent place, I think Oberlin or something like that. Well, there aren't very many scholars out here. I mean, they're very homespun people. We're getting more sophisticated. Colorado is becoming the place to go to for peace and quiet and decent lives, as compared with some of the difficulties you have in the major places like Chicago and New York. But it's a changing. It's getting more, as I say, sophisticated. Yeah.
Bill, can I ask you, just take you back for a minute to the days when you were president of the TSA? Do you remember what kinds of activities or demands there were on you as president? I think I'm just finishing my term. Baki's about to start his. I suspect what we confront is rather different than maybe it overlaps far more than we think.
I don't know. I won't ask you what you're facing because that might change my views. There were times when the major meetings of the Middle East studies were rather boring. They would get up in front of us and sort of stand around and talk. And the really exciting meetings were not the general meetings, but more the specific ones where you had individuals, particularly young scholars. I remember a young girl named Karen Baki, I think her name was.
Oh.
What her name was at the beginning. Married
That's
or not.
it.
But Karen was just an exciting scholar, and she was doing something on the Jalalis. Well, I'd done something, and she was so wonderful, and we talked a lot at all these meetings, and we got to know each other very well. Other scholars were very similar. Oh goodness, I remember them. A lady named Faruqi,
Soraya.
marvelous scholar, and she was always a little quiet. She'd sit back and listen, and then all of a sudden she'd say something. You wake up, wow, boy, does she know her stuff.
Yes.
So a lot of interaction, concern for all kinds, mostly personal. How my job better work, kind of sources can I get, and that sort of thing. But I had the feeling that they were a group that didn't have a feeling of one-upmanship or the feeling that they had to put themselves ahead of the next guy so that they showed forth there's a lot of that in the scholarly world, but these people were just interested in what was going on and how they could do a better job and how they could publish whatever they had, and was doing what they were doing, and genuine interest in each other. Very small group, usually 15 or 20 at the most at the big meetings, because there weren't a lot of Ottoman historians in those days, but there were some really good names. I had written down some of them. Ooh, boy, let me look here. Well, here were the really helpful scholars were people like Heath Lowry and Kemal Karpat, of course. Andy Hess was a dear friend. He was very involved in things. And Michael Cook, what a guy. He came to our house in Rubli Asar, and he went on and on and on. Such a bright guy, and
Yes.
so British. I guess he's at Princeton or something now.
Yeah, he was one of my teachers.
Was he? He's a great.
Yes.
He was one of my teachers too, and it's a big loss to Ottoman studies that he left the field. He wrote this very brilliant short book. It's there are a few legendary stories about it. I'm going to skip them, and then he edited a book, and after that he moved into early Islamic history. And that is where he continued his publications, and I became a student of his in sort of in the context of a history of Islam seminar. No longer. He didn't continue in socioeconomic, Ottoman socioeconomic history, unfortunately. He did say it was a small field. There was not a whole lot going on. And he felt, there was more going on in early Islamic history. So that's where he left. And I should tell you, Karen Barkey is at UC Berkeley now. And I see her every once in a while because we both live in Berkeley. She's doing great. And then Professor Faruqi is in Istanbul. She is right now at Ibn Haldun University. It's a private Turkish university, very new.
Yes.
She's in the history department there.
Yes, and she is still one of the most prolific people in our field.
Very, very.
She continually publishes, and she continually organizes events around new themes and pays particular attention to young scholars. So she's incredibly encouraging and supportive of younger scholars.
Great lady. Great lady. Wonderful.
She's terrific.
I'll never forget, was laughing because he was reading some documents in the archives, and he said, "It's fun to read the marginalia." And I said, "Oh boy, I'm having trouble just reading the Defter." And he said, "Oh, you should hear what these guys are saying. The Sultan must have had a bad night last night," or something like that. Because these are things that these guys, these Yaziges, or whatever they call them, were writing in the archival documents that became archival for us. So we're just standard stuff for them. Well, what other scholars? Don Quetters was a good friend. Of course, he's one of your presidents, I think. And
Yes.
Carter, haven't heard from him for a long time. Doug,
he's at OSU.
Is he?
He's but he's retired. He's just rather recently retired, and there's now a chair in Ottoman studies in his name at OSU, and I have no confirmed proof, but I think that he must have given part of the money for that chair, which I find to be a tremendously honorable thing to do.
Really?
I was very impressed.
Wow. Yeah, he was kind of a quiet guy. He was very serious when I met him. I don't know how he is now, but
Very serious, not so quiet.
okay, I don't know about that. Yeah. And then Norm Itzkowitz, I didn't know him as well. I met him 3 or 4 times, but he was one of Joe's Shulovich's friends. And Justin McCarthy was a good friend, but he got out of the business, I think. I don't think he's.
Yeah, he was sort of easing out when I got in. He was kind of had a fringe thing going in demography. But Norman Iskowitz was, I believe he was Baki's teacher.
Right. I was probably his last PhD student. He retired the year I got my degree, which was in 2001, and we lost him in 2019. He passed away last year.
Yeah.
Oh.
But he was also one of my teachers at Princeton. I remember he was one of my examiners for my general exams, and his question, because I was working on agrarian things, he asked me to outline a lecture on the Tamar system, which I did. And then when I came in for my orals, he said to me, "So how many weeks is it going to take you to give this lecture?"
Ah,
Because I had included too much detail,
oh dear.
had no sense of, how long a lecture lasted or what you could actually say in 50 minutes.
Oh, boy.
It was a little embarrassing, but
I'm really curious about the history of the prizes that our association gives. Probably we'll look into this in the documents to find out which one started when. Were you at the time when you were president giving regularly book prizes every year, article prizes, language prizes, and things of that sort?
It was limited. There weren't too many, 2 or 3 maybe. There was always one for a student, and there were for the more mature authors. But we didn't have a lot of money. Didn't,
we still don't have a lot of money. That's consistent.
hasn't changed much. But it was as I say, it was a very warm feeling to go into a group of friends, and it was always, well, considering what we talked about last time, which was 10 months ago, what are we doing about so and so? And you just sort of pick up from what you were talking about the last time you met. And there was never any difficulty. It was always a warm group of people. Some of the leadership was more standoffish than others. Some, I think, as you're in the middle of it now, you're realizing that you have to kind of put a firecracker under some people. Others, you just leave them alone, and they'll do what they need to do, and others, they come in and they drop out, and you don't know what happened to them. But all of them have this desire to check out something new that they've learned about the Ottomans or the Turks. I don't know quite why the name has been changed, but I presume I've been reading something about the fact that the name Ottoman is preferable over Turkish, but not quite sure why that is the case. But
Actually, I think we didn't abandon Turkish, but I think people felt they wanted to make it clear that we cover and welcome people in the organization who work on everything from the Ottoman Empire through modern Turkey. Because the European organization, the CIEPO, which was founded at roughly the same time in the early 70s, has been very adamant that it is pre-Ottoman and Ottoman and not Turkey. So that organization doesn't have anything to do, and it mostly exists to hold a conference every 2 years or 3 years, but they have nothing to do with modern Turkey. For them, everything ends with the founding of the Republic. But they do pre-Ottoman and Turkish literature, and in early Turkish literature and language. So they have a kind of different focus, and they don't really have an organization that does things between one meeting and another.
Well, I do know that all scholars have, how shall I say this politely, as an academic, you have obligations to yourself, to your studies, but also you have some obligation to the students that you teach daily. And I used to have the feeling that some of my colleagues just didn't have time for the students. If they could, I remember hearing somebody from another department going up the stairs. If it weren't for the students of this place, you could really make this a darn good university. But plague of students always surrounding you. Well, to me, that was the reason I was there. And that is certainly one reason why I did fewer publications and did a lot more work at this on the student level here. I was, but I'm not sure. You have to have both. You really need both, and it's a little difficult. I remember a student of mine told me he had heard Richard Feynman speaking at Caltech down in Pasadena, and Feynman was one of these people who was a genius on his field, but he could tell a story. And one of the famous stories that my student said, he was there. I was working at Pasadena High School at the time. Went over to Caltech, and Feynman was bouncing a tennis ball. And he said, well, I put it in this something or other, and then we bounce it again, and it exploded. I don't know why. I mean, something that he'd done. And everybody laughed. And he said, see, that's my point. And of course, you never forgot it. I have not forgotten it. And it's been 60, 70 years ago that I heard it about, didn't see it. But he had a master ability of bringing physics to people. And there are very few of those, I guess, who really can do that. But there are some. And one of the things that I urged my Turkish studies friends to do, to keep pushing the young people who are qualified in those regards. Don't deny them the chance to teach well if they can, because it's the teaching that keeps our profession going. We've got to have students somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
I had some very good college professors who inspired me to get more interested in history, who, like what you mentioned, they didn't necessarily have an extremely long list of publications, but they were amazing professors in class. They were amazing instructors in Turkey. Oral Sander, he was a scholar of diplomatic history, Ottoman diplomatic history, sort of international history. I mean, he would give a lecture and we would just be all mesmerized watching it. And another one, Bilge Chris, she worked on late Ottoman history and became a scholar of international relations. Very well published, but not like a very long list. But her classes is what inspired so many of us at the time to pursue more of history. And so
Yeah.
I completely hear you, what you're saying. It's indeed very important to pay attention to that. And I want to share one anecdote with what you just said about running classes without students. There is actually an Ottoman minister of education in the late 19th century who is supposedly once said, it would be so easy to run the Ministry of Education without the schools.
That's exactly right. Well, there is a responsibility we have for the taxpayer, who, at least in my case, it's not a private university. And so somebody's got to pay for this, and you have a responsibility for the guy who's putting the dollar on the table.
Yeah.
Definitely.
It's true.
Do you happen to know any of the past presidents of TSA? We would love to hear your memories. Some of them we won't have a chance to interview because they passed, such as Kemal Karpat, such as, actually, you already mentioned Shah. You mentioned him. You mentioned Stanford Shaw. You said you met him at Rumeli Hisarı, and he passed away too. So some of the scholars, early presidents, are no longer with us. So if you happen to have any memories with Kemal Karpat or Stanford Shaw or someone else who is no longer with us. We would love to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, a couple more of the people on the list of the early leaders of the organization were Rod Davison,
Rod Davis, yeah.
who was, and I actually remember meeting him because my parents live in DC, so I actually saw him a couple of times when I was there, but also Walter Weicker, I think, is somebody who none of us ever had a chance to meet.
Very intense person. Yeah, he had always some problem to solve, either locally or in terms of his scholarship. Very intense. Joe Shulovich would be able to tell you about him.
Okay.
He would visit down in Pasadena and Denver, and I would go him several times then. But Walter was, I think he was in I don't know what university, but it was.
I have Rutgers written down. Does that sound right?
Yeah, New Jersey or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was quite a character.
And Rod Davison?
Davison was just a mellow guy. He was enjoyable. He would take you out to dinner and just really, he was a lot like Sid Fisher. Sidney Nettleton Fisher was he'd tell you stories that you'd hard. Well, these were before he were married. So when he was doing graduate work, I don't know where he was, whether he was in Istanbul or whether he was in Europe. But right after the war, he was involved with all kinds of people, and he'd tell you the stories. I can't tell you them now because I don't remember the punchlines, but these guys were very human beings. It's hard to believe. You read their stuff and the books and so forth, but they're very human, and they're always. You just ask them some story about their past, and they open up.
So can we ask you, because we heard a little bit about what was apparently the founding meeting of the Turkish Studies Association. Someone told us that apparently it took place in his house, in Sidney Fisher's house, when there was a MESA meeting out, where was he living? I can't remember, someplace.
I think it's Michigan.
Yeah, in Michigan, maybe it was in Detroit or something, and that there was a kind of get together in his home, and that was where the Turkish Studies Association was founded. Were you perhaps present?
I wasn't there. Well, that must have been the year before.
1970, that's what Alan Fisher told us. This meeting was apparently in 1970, and then in 71, they founded the association.
I think I was there at the 71, but I don't think I know I wasn't there at the 70. I don't remember being at anybody's home. That's quite possible because we were living out of a tin cup at those times. I mean, who knew what we were going to be making? And you might get some ideas from Joe when you interview him. Was he ever president? Was Joe Shulovich ever?
Yeah, he was. I think he was the second president.
Yeah.
According to my list, he was, yes, he was right after Kemal Karpat.
We will interview him next Monday, hopefully.
Good. Well, Joe will have lots of stories to tell. He's doing pretty well. I mean, we're all getting older. It's hard to believe, but Joe is still able to drive. They have a new car that goes on electricity now.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
That's a very optimistic thing, buying a new car.
Oh, I guess it is.
My father just turned 90, and they went to see friends of theirs who have a gallery, and he bought a painting, which I thought was hugely optimistic, you know? Most people tell me, once people pass 80, they tell me they stop acquiring anything. So,
Wow. Well, it would, your father must have ambitious. That's wonderful.
he must have, I'm sorry.
Ambition. I think that's wonderful to be able to start off something new at that age.
Yeah, I just think he enjoys what he enjoys, and he doesn't see any reason to sort of close up shop before the shop closes him.
I agree with that.
So,
Well,
One other question we have, I think it's the last one in our list of questions, is whether you faced a particular challenge while you were president that you would feel comfortable sharing with us as the current president and president-elect for our own tenures. Any advice we could get from you, or any experience you'd feel comfortable sharing that was challenging?
sometimes I think we had some problems getting people to run for office because it's a responsibility to get people to do the job. And I noticed the name Margaret Hole, Hoel, Peggy, we called her, was on. She wasn't really an Ottomanist or a Turkish specialist. She lived in Turkey for a long time and I think taught something like that. But she was just a very solid working person. And boy, could we use people like that. So often we'd have people elected to be secretary or something. I'm not specifying any particular secretary, but they would say, well, yeah, I can do that. And then maybe it would get done and maybe it wouldn't. And then very often problems, and particularly as treasurer. I think I was treasurer for about 4 years because I couldn't get anybody to take it over. I think Don Quillard had it before me. He was happy to get rid of it. Bob, writing to people saying, hey, we need your money. But
yes,
yeah.
that is not the fun part.
Yeah, it really is. I suspect there's not a lot of demand on the part of, well, what am I trying to say? That sometimes your academic superiors demand so much at home that you just don't have time if you're going to keep up with your scholarship to get it all done. And you take these things on because somebody has to, and then they sort of fritter away, and that's not good. It does. I remember thinking maybe we ought to get a professional, just hire somebody to do this professionally, but that,
Did you ever have the money for that?
so I gave that up. But
Yeah.
there are, these are constant problems I'm sure you'll face.
Yeah.
But it's important that Turkish or Ottoman studies are forefront in doing the work, the research, publications, things like that. But it's also important to have a voice to tell the public that Turks are not just people who kill Greeks or whatever it is they are known for. They are a very important part of our civilization, and we ought to know what's going on there. So I'm not being very, I'm being prosaic rather than poetic. So,
Well, I think that it's not a bad message, and particularly right now, when it's very easy to demonize Turkey, and you can choose on what grounds to do it in any given week. I think it is important to say to people, there's more there. There's more going on. It's a country of 80 million plus people with a long history and incredible culture. And, if you were going to tar and feather people on the grounds that people do Turkey, pretty much every country in the world would be on your list.
Yeah,
So,
get the mirror out there and look at our own bad case.
yes.
We have lots to learn. But for us who were there at the beginning, it was a remarkable time because we really were able to found something new, something exciting. And I think the Turkish government for a long time was very interested in what we were doing. And I always felt welcomed by the Turkish scholars, particularly Nejat Göyünç, who was my dearest friend. He was so helpful, and I lament his passing. Some of the most wonderful times of our lives, and I say ours because you met my wife. It's been a family tradition that, and it's interesting when my daughter had so much trouble with the state parks in California. She needed to go somewhere. We went to Turkey, took a trip all around Anatolia, drove miles and miles and miles, went all the way up to Erzurum and clear up to Baku and all the rest. And just had a wonderful time sort of realizing the greatness of this country. And they do some dumb things, but there's some wonderful people there. And we just had, and our students are still there, many of them.
Mhm.
The ones we had in the 1950s. Can you imagine?
Wow.
80s. But there they are, and they're doing the best they can. So Turkey's
Yeah.
something special. Anyway, it's been wonderful asking me these questions. I wish I had a better memory and a more articulate.
Oh, I think you do yourself an injustice, because you've shown us the perspective on the profession and also your particular story of how you got into it. And these are things that, this is why we're doing these interviews, because I think if we don't have a record of this, we don't have, and it's important to capture it for people. Otherwise, they have a very kind of narrow view of what this is all about.
Yeah,
And it's hard for us to tell your story. It's much better if you tell it.
yeah. Well, it is kind of a curious thing why you would go into studying. It's like studying Rwanda or something like that. Why would you? I suppose if you've gone there and want to say something, it'd be one thing. But we hadn't even gone. We just had heard about it. Yeah, it's a great country.
Well, I can say that I've asked, other people over the years how they got into it. And there's nobody who says, I stuck a pin in a map and decided that was where I was going. There's always some other connection. So, and some of it's very accidental. So I remember both Heath Lowry and Leslie Pierce went as part of the Peace Corps, but neither one of them had chosen Turkey. They chose other places. And because of political conditions or other restrictions, they ended up going to Turkey. So that's two of the major people in our field who just backed into it. And I certainly backed into it. I mean, it just, Baki, it's a whole lot more obvious why you would be interested in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey. I mean, it's your home. But for the others, I mean, Michael Cook, I think his father was an archaeologist, is that right? And I think Cornell Fleischer's father was in the diplomatic service, is that right? I mean, once you start to ask, you realize that it is just a whole series of kind of accidental connections.
Now that's the thing, what you just said. I think that is very interesting because it didn't occur to me until you said it, that of course that's true. Most of them like ourselves. We went in because we wanted to do some teaching overseas, and Turkey's not as good as any place, but very serendipitous. Certainly not something we ever thought of doing earlier on.
Yeah, I think Don Quatter told me that he first went to Turkey because he had signed up for some kind of a building job or something like that, either in a summer in college or something, and he got sent out to a project in Zonguldak.
Oh my,
And there he was, and he stayed in Zonguldak for his whole career, basically. I mean,
oh my.
yeah.
Our last question is just to open up, if you can think of anything else to add that you didn't mention earlier that comes to you now. And to that, I'll add, you mentioned your students in Turkey. Did you keep in touch with any of those middle school students after you left Turkey, came back, and follow up with what they have done after Talas in Kayseri? And by the way, Kayseri produced one of the more recent presidents of the country. Abdullah Gül is from Kayseri. I don't know whether or not he is from Talas. I don't know enough, but he is from Kayseri.
Well, the relationship with Turkey continues. We still have a student. He's in his 80s now, who is now doing a great deal of translation, because he does this of whatever he wishes to do, and then he makes some money translating from Turkish to English, or sometimes back from English to Turkish. And his father was a poet, and he, Ülkün Tansel is his name. He writes to us on occasion, maybe twice, 3 times a year. His wife was working for some American corporation translating things, so they're very much in the English-Turkish sphere. And we get information from him about some of the other things. I'm on a Turkish language group that get on my email every day. I get dozens of these things.
Wow.
And gatherings. They're the end of, let's see, the school at Talas was given over to the National Wrestling Corporation or something. So Talas is now a place where wrestlers go for Turkish, for their athletic program. And so they they are the last of the classes that we taught there. And we were a very good junior high school teaching the language. Many of them went over to Robert College or to some other major place where they could do their graduate work. One of our students became a professor himself. 2 or 3 of them went off to England or to Germany, things like that. But we've had a good record, but no school. It's gone. And we're sorry for that, but the government decided to close it, and that's the government's privilege. And we didn't argue with that. But it's been our life for all these many years. And our kids are still fond of Turkey, want to go back again sometime once things die down. What was it someone told us? If you wait till the Middle East gets peaceful and dies down again, you'll never go.
This is true, sadly.
That,
this is true.
but anyway, we are the fortunate heirs of a lot of people who've been there before, and laid the groundwork for us. We did what we could while we were there, and now the younger scholars are doing it. I'm so proud of them. People like Karen Barkey, my goodness, she was such a sweet young lady when I first met her. Still is, I'm sure. Did she marry somebody very famous?
She married somebody who became very well known.
Oh,
His name is Tony Marks, and he was, among other things, the head of the New York Public Library.
oh, really?
He was also the president of Amherst College, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, before he was head of the library.
Well, that's wonderful. Please give her my special regards if you do see her, because
Okay,
those are wonderful friends.
yes.
I'll tell her for sure.
She was one of my first Turkish friends, actually, also.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly been a pleasure chatting with you. I wish we were better.
We're very grateful for your time and for your memories. You've been extremely generous, and I think
Thank
that really
you so
you
much.
showed us things that we didn't understand and didn't know about.
Well, there ought to be some wonderful stories, but I can't remember them. That's the trouble.
You had some great ones already. Thank you so much for making time. Thank you.
Did.
Thank you.
It's an honor to have been chosen to do this, but thank you for your work. And hang on to the future for the Turkish Studies Association. I think that's very important that you do. And it's a pain at times.
Here you go, Baki. That's what you need to hear.
Yeah.